the continuation of taxpayer-funded bailouts. Gentleman of Texas, 6 minutes.
Gentleman of Texas recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Chair, I rise tonight to oppose the permanent Wall Street bailout and increased job losses through Credit Rationing Act of 2009. If Congress had to abide by the truth in advertising laws that they impose on the rest of the nation, surely this would be the official title of, indeed, this 1,279-page piece of legislation. Madam Chair, it is Section 1609N, for those who may have written the legislation and forgotten it, that creates a permanent $200 billion bailout fund. To paraphrase a line from the famous Kevin Costner movie Filled with Dreams, if you build it, they will come. The only reason to create a Wall Street bailout fund is to bail out Wall Street permanently. Now, the Democrats claim, Madam Chair, that the bailout fund will not be paid for by taxpayers. But, Madam Chair, these are the very same people who told us that the GSEs, the government-sponsored enterprises, would never receive a dime of taxpayer money. And I guess, in a sense, they were literally correct. Instead, it's $1 trillion. $1 trillion of taxpayer money now committed to the failed government-sponsored enterprises. These are the very same people who told us that, hey, don't worry about the Social Security Trust Fund, it'll get paid back. Medicare is financially sound. The National Federal Flood Insurance Program will never need a taxpayer infusion. Madam Chair, they were wrong then, and they are wrong now. Besides creating a permanent Wall Street bailout fund, Madam Chair, this bill represents the fourth piece of the Democrats' failing economic agenda. First was the $1 trillion stimulus. Next, the $600 billion national energy tax. After that, the $1 trillion government takeover of our health care plan. Now, we all remember the stimulus plan. The President told us if it was enacted, that unemployment would never rise above 8%, yet our unemployment rate is at double digits, the worst in a generation, and the legislation before us will cause even more job losses. In sections 4301, 4304, 4308, it will do this by empowering an unelected czar to unilaterally give the power to unilaterally ban and ration consumer credit products and then finance itself through hidden taxes on consumer credit and successful American companies. You heard the study alluded to earlier. Interest rates paid by consumers would rise 1.5%. New jobs would be reduced by almost 5% in our economy. More jobs would be lost, Madam Chair, under the bailout authority, which assesses $150 billion of taxes on large financial firms. Now, maybe those on the other side of the aisle wish to engage in the myth that somehow that won't be passed on to consumers, that somehow this won't impact credit lines at small businesses, but they are wrong. Increased interest rates, increased fees, fewer loans to small businesses. Madam Chair, once again, more jobs will be lost under the permanent Wall Street bailout and increased job losses through Credit Rationing Act of 2009. The United States Chamber of Commerce has said that if this act is passed, quote, it would have a significant adverse effect on small businesses by restricting their access to credit. Some would lose credit altogether. You know, Madam Chair, I talk to a lot of good community bankers in my part of Texas. I've heard the chairman allude to the ICBA, and I certainly respect those who have Washington zip codes. Frankly, I respect those who have Texas zip codes a little bit more. I talked to a man who helps build Palestine, Texas, Cad Williams, East Texas National Bank, and he said, Congressman, if I have more compliance cost and the federal government is going to limit the types of customized credit products I can offer, we will lose jobs in Anderson County, Texas, that I have the privilege of representing in Congress. I heard from a small businessman in my district from Jacksonville, Texas. Quote, as a small businessman, the restriction on credit may very well mean the end of my company. Madam Chair, why should we pass any legislation that will harm the ability of small businesses to access credit in the midst of a credit contraction? After 3.6 million of our fellow countrymen have lost their jobs since President Obama took office, I asked my Democratic colleagues, how many more jobs have to be lost? How many more? And Madam Chair, next, the government takeover. Again, after proposing the $600 billion tax on our energy sector, a $1 trillion takeover of our health care system, the Democrats now bring us the next chapter in the narrative, and that is the takeover of huge portions of our consumer credit and finance markets. They will create a huge new complex government bureaucracy and grant it sweeping draconian powers. Section 1104 will allow it to break up successful companies like Dell Computer or American Airlines. Section 204 and 4306 will allow it to dictate the pay structure all the way down to a bank teller in East Texas making $25,000 a year. And the gentleman grant an additional minute.
I will yield the gentleman another 2 minutes.
Gentleman yields 2 minutes.
Madam Chair, Section 4301 will allow it to decide, again, which credit cards, which home mortgages, and which car loans we are allowed to receive. And the list goes on and on and on. Madam Chair, what this really leads us to is a bailout and job loss bill where the big get bigger, the small get smaller, the taxpayer gets poor, and the economy gets more political. Madam Chair, what does a political economy look like? Well, we've seen it. We've seen it in the government-sponsored enterprises of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, where we give them these monopoly powers. They're allowed to grow these profits, but then they do a deal with Congress. Oh, but you have to have an affordable housing mission. You have to have this political mission. And $1 trillion of taxpayer liability exposure later, we know how that turned out. That's what a political economy is about. How about GM and Chrysler? When they went bankrupt, all of a sudden allies of the administration, the United Auto Workers, they end up with a sweetheart deal. In Chrysler, senior secured creditors received 29 cents on the dollar, but the United Auto Workers received 43 cents on the dollar, and they ended up owning the company. How convenient. That's what a political economy looks like. And look at individual members of Congress, including the distinguished chairman of this committee. From the Wall Street Journal, dated June 5th, 2009. Quote, the latest self-appointed car czar is Massachusetts' own Barney Frank, who intervened this week to save a GM distribution center in Norton, Massachusetts. The warehouse, which employs some 90 people, was slated for closure by the end of the year under GM's restructuring plan. But Mr. Frank put in a call to GM CEO Fritz Henderson and secured a new lease on life for the facility. Now, I respect our chairman. I'm not here to suggest.
Expired.
I yield the gentleman an additional 1 minute.
Give them a minute because they're listening in Norton.
I know that the distinguished chairman relishes this. And again, I'm not here to suggest that the activity was illegal, was immoral, was even fattening. I'm here to suggest it is what a political economy is all about. I would suggest anyone else besides the chairman of the Financial Services Committee making that telephone call, that facility wouldn't be open today. Under this bill, Madam Chair, Americans' job security will depend less on how well you perform your job at home and more upon who you know in Washington. That's what the political economy is all about. This bill represents an assault on the fundamental economic liberties of the American citizen. If you want a home mortgage, you now have to get the approval of the federal government. If you want to offer a credit product, the federal government. If you build a successful business, it can be torn down unless you go to the federal government on bended knee. Fewer jobs, more bailouts, more
Gentleman's
government
time has
control,
expired.
less personal freedom. It is time to reject this bill.
Gentleman